Good evening and welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. Thank you for joining us tonight for our book event featuring Pulitzer Prize-winner Washington Post reporters Scott Higham and Sari Horwitz, authors of The American Cartel, Inside the Battle to Bring Down the Opioid Industry. And our special guest, journalist Beth Macy, author of the New York Times best-selling Dopesick and new book, Raising Lazarus. I'm Jen Judson, land warfare reporter for Defense News and president of the National Press Club. We're looking forward to a robust discussion today, and we're also happy to take questions from the audience. If you have a question today, please write them on the cards at your seats and pass them to Donna sitting up here in the front row. Thank you. I want to begin by saying my two little boys don't have an uncle. My husband doesn't have a brother. I'm going to try to get through this. My mother-in-law doesn't have her oldest son. They don't have him because John Paul Vastola died on March 14, 2009 in Morgantown, West Virginia, a long way away from his home in Connecticut. His addiction to OxyContin and ultimately heroin lured him there. He hadn't spoken to his family for quite some time. I never got to meet him, and I will never get to watch him play with his kids, with my kids, and there always will be a hole in my husband's heart and in my mother's heart over this terrible loss. I'm sorry, I thought I could get through that without crying. And what makes this ever more devastating is that my family's story is not at all unique in America. I'd like to hold a moment of silence for John and for everyone who has died in this epidemic and for all of their families who continue to hurt. Thank you. Nearly 75% of the nearly 92,000 drug overdose deaths in 2020 involved an opioid, an increase of 38% over the previous year. It's clear we have a problem. In President Biden's State of the Union address this year, he identified beating the opioid epidemic as a key element of his agenda, and the federal government in May announced $1.6 billion in grants to states and territories to support drug abuse prevention and treatment. But the problem is decades in the making, beginning with a wave of addiction that swept through the country following the introduction in 1996 of the prescription opioid OxyContin. Our guests today have examined every aspect of the opioid epidemic. In Dopesick, journalist Beth Macy gives a definitive account of the opioid epidemic, taking the reader from the creation and marketing of synthetic opioids by Big Pharma to the communities it devastated. The book's gripping story is the basis of the Hulu series Dopesick. Ms. Macy, who spent 25 years as a journalist at the Roanoke Times, today brings us Raising Lazarus, which takes the reader to the places hardest hit by the epidemic to give us a clear-eyed portrait of the devastating effects of the crisis and the challenges of the public health response. In American Cartel, Washington Post reporters Scott Higham and Sari Horwitz take a hard look at the role drug companies played in the epidemic of opioid addiction. The book argues that pharmaceutical manufacturers operated like drug cartels and colluded as an industry to create a regulatory environment that allowed them to thrive even as the crisis grew. The book follows a small group of DEA agents and lawyers as they uncover thousands of memos, emails, and invoices documenting the opioid industry's indifference to the growing epidemic as it built its addiction empire. We are grateful to have with us today all three of these extraordinary journalists to discuss these important issues. Thank you so much for joining us today. Beth, I'm going to start with you. Opioids have been around for more than 100 years. For most of that time, the medical profession used them to treat only the most severe pain for hospitalized patients. So how did the introduction of OxyContin change how doctors treated pain?
Yeah, great question. For 100 years, we knew that they should only be used for cancer, end of life, serious post-surgery pain. And Purdue flipped the narrative. They knew they couldn't market directly to patients, but so they did the next best thing, which is maybe even better. They marketed to the doctors, and they exaggerated the benefits and downplayed the risks. And, and they co-opted the FDA, which allowed them to say it was virtually non-addictive, particularly in comparison to competing opioids like Percocet and Vicodin. And, and the part that really gets me being from Appalachia is they went into these poor communities that were already struggling with shutting down of coal mines and furniture factories and whatnot. And they did that because they knew there were high incidences of workplace injuries. And doctors are already comfortable prescribing opioids. And then they hired an army of reps, 5,000 doctors, nurses, pharmacists to become paid spokesmen for the company. So I don't know if anybody's in here seen the show, but when you see Billy the rep and then Michael Keaton's character, the doctor, go on to become a paid spokesman for the company, that's exactly what happened. We got all the scenes in that are taken from interviews, documents, and that's how it all started. And you guys kind of take the story over from there.
So just to quickly pile onto that, Beth, what led you to the OxyContin story initially?
Well, I was the families beat reporter for the Roanoke Times back when we had such things. And the story, and I usually wrote about inner city marginalized communities, and story on everybody's mind back in 2012 when I was assigned to write about these two wealthy private school kids whose families were upended by what we then called the heroin crisis. Now we call it the overdose crisis because it's like polysubstance. But so I wrote about these two families. One, the young kid had died of overdose, and the other was about to go to federal prison for 5.5 years. And I followed these two moms in particular as the kid who was about to go to prison was getting ready to go to prison. He was meeting with Saturday school kids who were in trouble. He was trying to build back some karma. He was getting really good at karate because he knew it was going to be a really tough environment. He taught me the word dopesick. He came to our opening of the show in Roanoke at our little independent theater. He went, "Dude, I taught you that word." And he would say, he'd say, at the end of your journey, you're not doing it to get high. You're doing it so as not to be dope sick. So if you've got this amount of dope and you're not going to see your dope man again until next Thursday, you're going to parse it so you have a little bit every day because it's the first thing on their mind. That drug hijacks the part of the brain that's in charge of decision making and planning ahead. And it makes them think that they're not going to die, but it makes them feel so bad that they think they're going to die. And then their whole world revolves around that. So it really started out as a newspaper thing. I picked it up in 2015. I don't know if I've ever told you this story, but I actually pitched this as a follow-up to Factory Man, my first book about globalization, which came out in 2014, because at the end of reporting for that, crime was going up in these little tiny towns that had once been thriving. And a lot of it was drug crime and heroin in little towns like Martinsville, Virginia, which once had the most millionaires per capita. And when I pitched it to my agent and my editor in New York, and because I had just done this series for the paper, and they go, heroin, this is like 2013, heroin, oh, we had heroin here in the 90s, like it was a trend. And so it wasn't until I wrote the proposal that I really started going back and saying, how do we get here? And basically, it broke out in my part of the world. The case that we follow in the show takes place from the Roanoke U.S. Attorney's Office, the Abingdon office, which was like basically a strip mall taking on these billionaires. And, they won. It was a mixed win, but they won.
Okay. Scott and Sarah, in American Cartel, you make the case that the pharmaceutical industry operated like a drug cartel. So what led you to that conclusion?
First of all, I just want to say I'm very sorry for your loss, and there are other people in the audience today who have lost a loved one, and this is the reason Scott and I really wrote this book, to make people care about this issue and go beyond the numbers and the policy statements and see how urgent this problem is. Beth's work was groundbreaking, and if you haven't seen Dopesick, you should definitely see it. And our story really picks up after that, because after Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers did what they did, and then the government started cracking down on them a bit in 2007. There were executives there that pleaded guilty to misdemeanors, but that market was open, and Purdue really ignited that, the epidemic. And then these other companies all moved in. And this is something a lot of people don't know about. And the other companies that have moved in many of them are household names. CVS, Walgreens, Walmart, Johnson & Johnson. And some of the companies that moved into this market of opioids we'd never heard of. One of them was Mallinckrodt, a company based in St. Louis, which actually ended up manufacturing, they were a generic manufacturer of oxycodone, 30 times the number. For every pill that Purdue produced, they produced 30 times more. And in our 2-year investigation, we found that the Drug Enforcement Administration called them the kingpin in what they called the American Cartel. Basically, these companies the executives there were drug dealers in business suits. And we were sort of astonished at this. The companies, major companies in America were flooding communities all over the country with these dangerously addictive pain pills. And in fact, 100 billion pills over a 6-year, I believe it was a 6-year period. And we know this because the Washington Post, and we can talk about this more later when we get into the litigation, but they filed a legal action to get hold of a confidential database that the Drug Enforcement Administration had that showed that these companies absolutely knew where their pills were going, and it tracked from manufacturer to distributor to pharmacy, and we were able to see that 100 billion pills flooded American communities. And so the title came from, when we talked to the DEA, their reference to, there are Mexican cartels, well, there's an American cartel too.
Absolutely. Got anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, this epidemic didn't really need to happen. It could have been prevented. It could have been prevented when the federal government went after Purdue and fined them $680 million or whatever, and told them to reformulate OxyContin so it couldn't be abused anymore. But by then, like Sari said, all these other companies had jumped into this market, and so Purdue set the table. And the guardrails that were put up, and there are very serious guardrails that are set up by the federal government, laws, regulations, all kinds of things to prevent pills from reaching the black market. So it's, you go from the manufacturer to distributors to the pharmacies, and each one of these segments of the supply chain, it has to obey the law. And these companies did not obey the law. They ripped down these guardrails and they allowed these pills to spill out all over the place. And they ripped them down by manipulating the levers of power in Washington, by funneling millions of dollars to the campaign coffers of members of Congress, by hiring legion of lawyers and lobbyists to flood Capitol Hill, and by hiring some of the most powerful law firms in town here to represent them and to keep them out of trouble. And so when you talk to the DEA agents that that were heavily involved in this, they saw, to your question, they saw exactly the same kind of operation that they saw south of the border when they were in Colombia and when they were in Mexico, and they were looking at how the hierarchies ran and how their supply routes ran and how they distributed and marketed their drugs. And they were like, these are the same exact operators, except for, like Sari said, they're in business suits, they're in corporate suites, and they have these lawyers who are representing them. So it was astonishing to us when we started to see all the data and the documents that we got from this legal action that we filed. We intervened in this massive lawsuit that's pending right now. There are some 3,000, 4,000 communities that are suing 24 companies. And all this material started being produced as part of this court case. And we said, look, this is information that is public and we want access to it. And they gave us access to it after a year of fighting. And that data and those emails and those internal audits showed that these companies knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly where their pills were going. They knew exactly how much harm they were doing, to the point where they were like making fun of the very people that were dying left and right. And it was just appalling. I mean, one of the things they did was they created a parody out of the Beverly Hillbillies theme song, and they called it the Beverly Pillbillies. And it's just you listen to, you read the lyrics of this thing, and it's just appalling. They were making fun of these people, and this is a company called AmerisourceBergen, third largest drug distributor in America, and they were circulating this thing around the company with little smiley faces, and isn't it great to see this again? You know, and Sari and I and all the reporters at the Post who were assigned to this project started sifting through these records, and you know, Sari and I have seen a lot of really horrible things in our careers. We've been reporters, you know, combined maybe 60 years, which is sad, you know, a little sad to say.
Hey, I think we might have 100 total.
That's right. And I think that we can all agree this is probably the worst thing that we've ever seen as reporters. Right, Beth, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I mean, especially the families impacted. You know, we've lost 1 million people to drug overdose since OxyContin came out in 1996, and it's predicted to double by just 2030. I mean, that's a curve that looks like this, and we have a treatment gap of 87%. That means that only 13% of folks with opioid use disorder managed to get evidence-based care in the last year. I mean, we should be rioting in the streets about this.
Absolutely. You know, we tend to think of the DEA as running operations against street dealers and Mexican drug cartels, as you kind of hit on, Scott. And you know, corporations that produce pills prescribed by doctors it doesn't look that way. So when the DEA started noticing this, you know, how did that alter their enforcement approach? Talk about, you know, how they were trying to get in on the tracking process and what that was like, and how that kind of flagged things for them.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we told this story through a DEA official. His name is Joe Renazizi.
He seems fiery.
He's very passionate about this issue. He really cared. He'd been in the DEA for about 30 years. He was a lawyer by training. He was a pharmacologist. And he ran a unit at the DEA, this speaks to your point, called the Diversion Unit, which policed the drug industry. And he saw what they were doing. He saw what Scott just explained to you. He saw they were breaking the law, and he started to go after them, especially the drug distributors, sort of the middlemen. There's the manufacturers, the distributors, pharmacies, and the distributors are supposed to, there's a red flag when a pharmacy this is under the Controlled Substance Act, when a pharmacy is ordering a highly unusual amount of pain pills and narcotics, a Schedule II drug. They're supposed to stop the order and figure out what's going on at that pharmacy and tell the DEA, and they weren't doing that. And so he started to go after them. He wrote them letters, he warned them, he began using tools from the DEA to shut down their warehouses one by one, and then they were forced to pay millions of dollars in fines. And at some point in this process, they got pretty angry because he was doing it over and over again to these big companies, Fortune 500 companies, and they began to fight back. And they, as Scott pointed out, they hired Washington lawyers, lobbyists, and they did a couple of things. They lobbied Congress to pass a law that basically defanged the DEA. It took away their ability to go after them. And
wasn't the law, like it sounded like it was just the best thing since sliced bread? Do you remember the name of the law?
The name of it was the Ensuring Safety
Ensuring Patient Access and Effective Law Enforcement Act. And it did not ensure
Any of it.
access to the drugs. It did not ensure, you know, effective
It
law
ensured
enforcement.
this.
It was the most ridiculous. It's so Washington, right?
And Obama signed it.
Obama signed it.
Every member of Congress, no member of Congress
Objected to it.
And then after they did that, they went after Joe. They used their contacts in the Justice Department and in the DEA, and they went after Joe Renazizi, and he was basically forced to resign. So we chose him. He's a very rich character, but we chose to tell this story because these guys are in government to protect us, and this is what happened to them.
And that's the first part of our book. And so then the second part picks up with these lawyers who start to see the breadcrumbs that Joe Renazizi and his team, who they were also destroyed, and they were all removed from their positions and sent to far-flung posts all across the country. And so the second part picks up with a young lawyer in Huntington, West Virginia, who sees a lot of overdoses in West Virginia, and he says, I think I'm going to try to do something about this, because his brother, who's a combat fighter pilot, like, challenges him and says, Paul, isn't this what you do for a living? Why don't you do something about this? And he goes on this journey, which we can talk about in a little bit.
I want to back up just a little bit on something that you mentioned, Scott, that there are supposed to be guardrails, one being the closed system that's supposed to monitor the manufacturing numbers by the pharmaceutical companies. This comes from an audience question. Why did the DEA allow this level of growth kind of in the first place? Where you see these pills coming through.
The quotas.
Yeah. Well,
You don't
so
really
I
sell
think
it
that's a question about quotas, which is very complicated and kind of mind-numbing. So we want to stay too much on quotas, but quotas are basically set. It's like a scientific rubric, right? So it's based on the number of prescriptions that are being written. It's based on how much drug manufacturers want for research. And so each year, the DEA sets the amount of opium that can be given to drug manufacturers to produce and manufacture.
And it very much goes back to Beth's point about the representatives selling this to the doctors, because by changing the narrative, as Beth pointed out, the doctors just kept prescribing, and the DEA, what Joe Renazizi always says is, look, if they're prescribing, we can't cut the quota because we don't know if we're going to be hurting legitimate pain patients. We can't just do a cut like that and not targeted, because we could be hurting legitimate pain patients.
Right, and this is a big talking point by the industry. They always say, well, if it was so bad, then how come the DEA kept allowing drug manufacturers to make these drugs? And so the industry likes to point its finger at everybody else except for itself. So you'll talk to the drug manufacturers and they'll say, well, it's the distributors' fault. We're just manufacturing them. The distributors should know. And distributors say, well, the pharmacies are dispensing. They should know. And they all say, well, the doctors are writing the prescriptions, so they should know. And then they all say, well, the DEA is, issuing these quotas and they're allowing this much to be made, so it's their fault. And so there's a lot of finger pointing and nobody taking any responsibility. And to this day, not one of these drug companies has apologized to the American public for what has taken place here, or said they're sorry.
Or taking responsibility.
Or taking
at all.
any responsibility, right?
You did a great job of explaining that very complex issue. The DEA did spend a lot of energy, I think, at first it seems, going after over-prescribing doctors, but then they changed their approach. So can you talk a little bit about that? I think it led to things like cracking down on pill mills, things like that.
Well, there are a lot of corrupt doctors. This just in, newsflash. And so I think what the DEA first realizes is that they could just arrest doctors all day long. And as soon as they arrest one, another one's going to pop up. And there was so much money to be made. There was a lot of cash changing hands. And they decided to start moving up the food chain, just like any good law enforcement officer would do. So if you're not being successful at this level, you go up to the next level. And so that's when they went up to the drug distributor level. And then they started hitting all those drug distributors, and then they went up to the manufacturing level, and they started hitting companies like Mallinckrodt, which was the largest producer of oxycodone in America. And a lot of people don't understand the difference between oxycodone and OxyContin. There really is none. The only difference is OxyContin was time-released, and it's oxycodone. It's pure oxycodone, but it's time-released. And so Purdue, their kind of magic formula was that, well, you can't get addicted to this because it's time-released, and over time it's going to come into your body, and so you can't get addicted to it. Well,
And that didn't even work.
that didn't even work, right?
Yeah.
And people quickly realized if you just crushed it, you'd get the pure oxycodone. So what Mallinckrodt saw was, well, we're not going to mess around with this time-release stuff. We're just going to sell pure oxycodone, generic, and their most popular pain pill was a 30-milligram pain pill, which is basically the equivalent of a hit of heroin. And it's pure oxycodone. You don't have to wait for anything. And that pill became so popular, they manufactured 1 billion of these pain pills. And it became so popular, they were blue with little M's on them,
Yeah.
that they called it the Blue Highway. It went from Florida, where all these scripts were being written by these pill mills and corrupt doctors, and they were all flooding through Appalachia, through the Midwest, up into New England, and then out into other places, but it was called the Blue Highway.
I have a quote in Dopesick where a woman says, so many people I know, it was oxy, roxy, which is the 30,
right.
and heroin, oxy, roxy, heroin.
Yeah.
And the incredible thing about this, and this brings us to today, is the public health crisis we're facing today is the fentanyl crisis. And the Mexican cartels, and Scott knows this because he was just down at the border and he saw this, they are sending over into the United States counterfeit pain pills that look just like the Mallinckrodt pills. They're blue, they have the M's, the 30s, and it's fentanyl. It's fentanyl. So if people take these on the street thinking it's an oxy, they could die pretty instantly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the drug cartels, south of the border are, whatever you think of them, they're really crafty and really smart, and they saw this market that had been created by Purdue, Mallinckrodt, Johnson & Johnson, all these companies. And then when they started getting into trouble and all these lawsuits started getting filed, the spigot got turned off pretty much in America, and it's very hard to get these pills now on the street. And the cartels were like, thank you very much. And they just started flooding. So, if you just put in M30 in Google and fentanyl, it's gonna blow up your computer, because that's all that's coming across the border now.
I was in Baltimore the other night, and a public health official said fentanyl is selling for $1 a pill.
Yeah,
One pill can kill.
one pill.
Yeah.
And they used to be
$1.
it used to be $1 a gram for the real stuff, for the real oxycodone. It was so 30 milligram pill would cost you $30. Now it's just a couple of dollars, and it used to be people didn't know that these were fentanyl, but now almost everybody knows that they're fentanyl, and they're seeking them out. Sari and I spent a lot of time, as I'm sure Beth did too, in drug rehab facilities and with people who are addicted, and a lot of them prefer fentanyl. It's like a cleaner drug. It's a better high. You come down off it not as hard as heroin. And it's a lot cheaper. $32,000 for a kilo of fentanyl can produce $20 million profit for the Mexican drug cartels. And so with that kind of a profit margin, they've stopped shipping heroin, they've stopped shipping cocaine, they're still shipping meth, but fentanyl is the #1 drug now.
Well, that's terrifying. I want to back up into the 1990s and early 2000s to kind of hit on a point in terms of how the opioid epidemic came about, and one of that is the fifth vital sign coming out as a way to identify or manage pain, if you will. The fifth vital sign is pain. And this is portrayed in Dopesick. They came out with a, measure your pain, scale of 1 to 10.
Smiley faces to indicate how much pain a patient was in.
Which they
So
still
talk
do.
about how that kind of transformed.
So the doctors started being rated, and the hospital started being rated on how do we manage your pain. And you still see the smiley faces today.
Yeah.
What is your
I
pain?
saw it when I had a baby. They had it was still on the
And
wall.
it really went down just like it is in the show. Like they could have lost their Medicaid, Medicare if they didn't follow this playbook. The Purdue and the other pharmas kind of used their influence to take over the JCO, Joint Commission, the hospital governing body, and they hired people like Russell Portnoy, who was a famous addiction expert in New York, and brought him in to talk about pain as the fifth vital sign at places like Cornell. I mean, all these places have Sackler-named buildings, although the name is starting to go down. And they hired a dentist named David Haddix, who had written this paper about pseudo-addiction. And pseudo-addiction was his wacky theory that if you were in a doctor's office and you were exhibiting signs of addiction. It wasn't addiction. It was actually pseudo-addiction, the cure for which is yet more OxyContin. And so, you know, we tell the stories in the show of that, and the study from 1980, which wasn't a study at all, it was just a letter to the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine saying that less than 1% of people get addicted. I mean, those are all the kind of the flash, the buzzwords. And my favorite, or the worst, is Richard Sackler, hammer the abusers. They are the culprits. They are the criminals. And that's what he did. He blamed people with opioid use disorder that he helped addict. And that was their playbook. And so that's what we've got to begin to unwind now. If we're going to turn this back, we've got to unwind the stigma and just this drug war approach to these folks, that many of whom initially were addicted because of the guardrails that got smashed, and the fact that the people who were supposed to protect us didn't.
You know, I don't know, how many people have seen Dopesick? One of the things I really loved about it is that, you know, it's Hollywood, right? So they could have done anything.
Oh, yeah.
And they didn't. They stuck to the facts, and the facts are kind of stranger than fiction. I think maybe one of the reasons why they didn't really have to hype it. And it was such an accurate portrayal of what had happened, and you should be super proud.
Oh,
because when Hollywood gets involved, anything can happen, right?
well,
And,
it could have gone wrong in so many ways,
Right.
and I really didn't want them to stereotype Appalachia. That was my main concern going in, but I also wanted a really clear message about medication-assisted treatment. Buprenorphine or Suboxone and methadone are the evidence-based treatments, just like antiretrovirals are the treatments for HIV/AIDS. And if we begin to offer treatment to the scale to match the crisis, you know, the stigma starts to go away, right? So if you see, and Danny, the showrunner, got that immediately. He's like, how can we make that exciting? You see an A-list actor like Michael Keaton struggle to get on methadone, struggle to get on Suboxone, and in 8 hours of pretty riveting television, you can learn the story of the bad guys, of the crusaders that were, you know, working to hold Purdue's feet to the fire, and then you can see the story of this one doctor that gets sucked in. And before we go on, I just want to recognize Ed Bish in the front row with his wife Grace. Ed lost his only son, Eddie, in 2001. He was 18 years old to an OxyContin overdose. Today is Eddie's birthday. How old would Eddie have been? 40. And Ed has been fighting for accountability ever since, literally. I think maybe you took a couple years off somewhere in there. You got a little tired. Burnout. Ed's portrayed in the last scene where you see the parents speaking at the federal courthouse in Abingdon. Ed is portrayed a lot in my new book, him and a bunch of activists that are trying to get the victims' voices heard in this very untransparent bankruptcy. You know, Purdue files for bankruptcy in 2019 in a jurisdiction not in Connecticut where they're from, but actually in White Plains, New York, because they know there's only one bankruptcy judge there that favors this loophole that would allow the Sacklers to leave the case with a lot of their wealth intact. And Ed has just been dogged. He joined this group, Nan Golden, talk about strange bedfellows, the activist, artist Nan Golden. You know, they would meet every Thursday on Zoom and plot. You know, they end up like protesting outside of Judge Drain's court. And Alexis Plus, who's going to be organizing a protest here this Saturday at, what's it called? Union Square?
Union Square, 11 a.m. it starts.
Yeah, called the Trail of
Perfect.
Truth.
We have a question on that, I think.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and
cares
say
about?
that. Alexis is also a parent who lost somebody. And she realized that her hometown wasn't acknowledging the losses. The cops didn't want to report the numbers, so she got the parents to report directly to her. And then they show out in front of the city council with all these tombstones of the dead. And they're all personalized with people's pictures on them. And they planted a cemetery to make them recognize that the communities weren't dealing with it. So Ed and Alexis and Nan partner up to try to get the victims' voices heard. And they did, to a large degree, but that case, of course, is still pending in appellate court in New York, so we're waiting to see what happens. But the distributor money is starting to come down now, and that's why I think it's so important for people to understand what really works in terms of turning this back and what doesn't.
And you know, if it wasn't for the parents, I don't think we would be here today, because they have kept this issue on the front burner. They have, and you know, now you've got all these lawsuits, and these companies are finally starting to be held to account, at least financially. There's probably going to be somewhere between $30 to $40 billion when it's all said and done that's going to start going out to all these communities. From the bankruptcies of Purdue, from Mallinckrodt, but also from these big settlements that these companies are entering into. Even though they say that, you know, they've done nothing wrong, they're not sorry for anything, they're paying billions and billions of dollars to get out of these cases, and that money is very important. But I think if you talk to a lot of parents like we do, and you talk to Ed and his wife, one of the things they'll probably tell you is, where is the real justice? Where are the criminal charges? Where is the accountability? You know, this money is really important, but like on the day that Johnson & Johnson and the three major distributors, McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, and Cardinal Health, settled the lawsuits against them for $26 billion, each of their share prices rose by 3% on Wall Street. And so this behavior, this corporate behavior, is going to continue until the Justice Department starts to do something. And this is kind of like deja vu all over again from the Wall Street debacle during the 2006, 2007, 2008 meltdown. I think like one person went to prison.
One lower level person.
Low-level person went to prison.
And we've had one pharma exec go to jail so
Yeah.
far. You know, until the white-collar criminals go to jail, the behavior will continue. And what's going to keep another drug maker from putting out a dangerous product and know that they can use this bankruptcy loophole to basically pay a parking ticket?
What's the outlook look like for potential criminal charges for some of these folks? I mean, obviously Purdue Pharma, you know, that they seem like the biggest villain here, of course, but there's many that deserve to have criminal charges brought against them here. But you know, like you said, there's been only a handful. So talk about you know, what we may see down the road. You know, is there hope that we'll see something like this kind of justice brought, or is it looking unlikely?
I think it's looking unlikely. Honestly, in our book, we talk about several big cases the DEA tried to make across the country against McKesson, a distributor, against Mallinckrodt, a manufacturer. And these cases basically went nowhere. Agents worked so hard with U.S. attorneys across the country. And in the end, the Justice Department just settled these cases with the companies paying fines. So I don't feel very hopeful they're going to bring any. Do you
I have a bit of hope. I mean, I attended this rally that Ed and Nan and the relatives against Purdue Pharma put together, and they were calling for indictments in front of the Department of Justice. Former prosecutors, Paul Peltier, Rick Mountcastle. I mean, former prosecutors were like, you must indict. And Ed, it was incredible. Now, when the first level of appellate released, they tried to overturn Judge Drain's decision that was going to allow this settlement to finish. Judge McMahon said, you, Judge Robert Drain, the bankruptcy judge, don't have a right to tell Ed Bish and the other 1 million Americans that they don't have a right to sue Purdue. And Merrick Garland came out in favor of that and said it was unconstitutional. Now, that's not the same as criminal indictments, but I think unless there's a groundswell of efforts for that, and one of the things Alexis is going to be talking about Saturday at the protest is the fact that we've got to make sure that this money that is coming down now is spent in a way that's evidence-based, that it doesn't just go to abstinence-only programming and more policing and more police cars. You know, that first fine that Purdue paid in 2007, not $1 of it went to treatment. We've got to make sure. There are communities that don't even know what they're getting money and they don't even know what they're going to do with it. So Alexis is calling for, really making sure that we bird dog how this money is being spent.
How are you seeing that take shape, in terms of being able to make sure that the money's going in the right place? Because, I think that you laid this out well in your book, that, it's still like, it seems like a lot of money, but when you spread it out over
18 years.
Yeah, and it's tied up, as I think even in the epilogue, like, you talk about how the money's still tied up. So, it's going to be small amounts, maybe spread out over time. So how do we, really use this money to see the change that we want to see? So what are some
one
of the
thing
things
that's
you're seeing?
different than the tobacco settlement, which was the state attorneys generals, and they used the money however they wanted.
Yeah.
In this case, it was, in the book we explain this in the epilogue, massive settlement negotiations. They just, this was during COVID. And they finally came up with this $26 billion settlement. They had to get, I think, more than 90% of localities, of the 4,000 towns, cities, counties, Native American communities to sign on to this. And they've set up an independent board that's going to monitor where this money goes. And each state has a pretty complicated formula for each locality. So there is a system in place to watch this, and I think it's up to all of us to kind of watch.
It's really
money
important
goes.
that the press
And it's supposed to
stay
go
on
toward
this.
treatment, prevention, education, and I think we all need to.
And harm reduction, yeah.
And we need to watch and see where it goes, and if it really does go to these communities that are so hard hit.
Can you talk a little bit more about Raising Lazarus? We haven't had much of
Sure.
a chance to dive into what it is your newest book covers. So give
Why,
us a little
thank
bit
you.
of a premise.
So if Dopesick was about the problem and all the barriers, Raising Lazarus is really about the solutions. And it starts out in a rural town, Hickory, North Carolina, in a McDonald's parking lot next to a dumpster, with a harm reductionist who's a nurse practitioner meeting a patient where he is. And he arrives late, he's high, he's got a broken face mask dangling from one ear. And he says, "I'm gonna die if I don't get off the needle." And Tim says he's gonna call in a discount prescription for buprenorphine the next day, but he wants them to know two things. And I think these are really the keys to turning back the crisis. One is you can get better. Most Americans don't think they can. They've written this population off. Most people with opioid use disorder don't think they can. 40%, the largest group, says they don't want to stop using drugs, and largely that's because they haven't been able to access treatment, or they've been stigmatized when they went to the hospital for an overdose or endocarditis or whatever. And the second thing he tells them, so first have hope. The second thing is don't disappear. And that's this idea of even if you are on this medicine and you return to use, because we know it's a chronic relapsing disease, still come back next week. And if you can't make it, text me and I'll come to you. So in 1970, pre-drug war kicking in, President Nixon hires the first drug czar in America, and he's this crusty psychiatrist named Jerome Jaffe, still practicing medicine, doing research at the University of Maryland. And he designs a standalone system of methadone clinics, 300 methadone clinics across the nation. And Nixon's trying to score points with the veterans that are coming back from Vietnam addicted to heroin. And they basically make treatment on demand available for these folks, along with social supports, counseling, help with housing. That's the model that we need to get to again. But back then, we had a formula that was 30% of our federal funding for addiction went to policing, 70 went to treatment. So we need to get that back in line again or flipped again, because we've got to make the treatments easier to access than the dope, and the dope is just so easy to access.
Mm-hmm. Question from the audience. Can you talk about the law enforcement response? Beth discusses the reluctance of police departments to recognize methadone, et cetera, treatment options. How does this change?
How does it change? Well, there's some good examples in the book. In Fairfax County, just right down the road, you have a sheriff there who every inmate gets screened, gets treated with medication-assisted treatment. She lets a harm reduction group come in, These are peers, people in recovery. They're all felons, so some rules had to be broken. You're going to let felons come into my jail? The deputies didn't like it. You're going to give people buprenorphine when some of the people in here have been arrested for diverting buprenorphine? They didn't like it a bit. Some of them had to go. I mean, that's courage. And that's a female sheriff with 13 years being the sheriff. She works with the harm reduction group. And the key with this is these peers are coming in and they're working with folks so that the moment when they get out, they have a plan. They get Narcan, they get buprenorphine, and then they get help. They get actually picked up the moment of release and taken to sober living or whatever they've arranged together. So there are models out there. We just have to scale them up.
Okay. I'm going to ask the last audience question card I have, then I'll ask a few more. So I'm not sure who this is, but Sari, how does Lyndon Barber sleep at night? And Scott, how can we stop so much fentanyl from entering the country?
Lyndon Barber. Okay, for people who haven't read the book, Lyndon Barber was a lawyer who worked at the DEA, and he worked closely with Joe Renazizi to go after these drug distributors. And this is a very important question, whoever asked it. It's an important question because we're here in Washington at the National Press Club, and one of the key themes in this book is the revolving door of Washington and how it was at its worst during this epidemic. The idea that people who are in government, public servants, people like Joe Renazizi, people like Lyndon Barber, who are there to protect us, to keep the guardrails up, the companies smartly went after them and lured them to work for the companies for very big salaries. And with Lyndon Barber, he, as a lawyer in the DEA who worked with Joe, who knew the law, who knew what Joe was trying to do and his team was trying to do, he was lured away and he went to a firm and began representing the drug industry. And not only that, he helped write the law that members of Congress introduced that undercut the DEA and basically stopped them from going after the companies, or made it incredibly difficult, nearly impossible, to go after the companies. So yes, that's a good question. Lyndon Barber has not wanted to talk to us and answer our questions, but he was one of the people, and there were, I think, 36 plus agents and people in the Justice Department who were lured away with big salaries to go work for the drug industry.
Do any of them sleep at night? I mean, how do these
And-
lawyers
well,
for
and the
Purdue making
lawyers,
$2,000 an hour sleep?
Well, that's a really good point about the lawyers, because when the Washington Post wanted to sue to get the confidential database that showed where all the pills went, the Washington Post lawyers went to the big law firms in Washington and some medium-sized firms to try to get help, to get legal counsel to help the Post. And they were all conflicted out. They all represented the drug industry. It's quite shocking. And so the Post went and they found a lawyer in Akron, Ohio, a lone practitioner. We have a whole chapter in the book about her, Karen Lefton. It's a real David and Goliath story, because she alone went up against the big firms and was able, won at the Sixth Circuit on appeal, was able to get us this database. It's a quite amazing story.
Excellent. And Scott, on the fentanyl question.
As Sari said, there's lots of heroes in our story in addition to the villains. So for every villain, there's a hero. So the fentanyl question is a really daunting one, and like Sari said, I was at the border a couple of times this year, and the drug agents down there are despondent. I don't think that's too strong of a word. They don't really know what to do. There's nothing that they can do. You have 70,000 vehicles coming through San Ysidro, the port of entry in San Diego, every single day. How do you search every single one of those vehicles? You just can't. And you've got people walking across the border every day. You could, you hear a lot of people saying, just seal the border, stop everything from coming. Well, that would just like wreck our economy, obviously. So you just can't. That's just not workable.
Scott, what should be happening with these, the chemicals that are coming from China to the cartels? Is there a way to stop that? I know they have stopped fentanyl from China, but now they're sending the precursor.
So you need precursor chemicals to make fentanyl, and fentanyl is an opioid. It's just a synthetic opioid. It's 50 times more powerful than heroin, 100 times more powerful than morphine. And you need these chemicals to make it. And China for a long time had been, just shipping the final fentanyl product directly into the United States through the mail. Then they stopped doing that, they shut that down, and then they started sending chemicals to the cartels. So the chemicals don't come through the United States, they come in through Mexico, and our relations right now with Mexico are all-time low. There's very little cooperation between the United States government and the Mexican government. The DEA is not really allowed to operate the way they used to operate down there. So that is a huge problem. And one of the biggest problems that law enforcement is starting to see is that the cartels themselves are making their own precursors.
Oh, wow.
And so, there was one guy down there who just said, like from the Alien movie, this is game over, man. It's game over. Once the cartels start making their own precursors, don't have to rely on chemicals from China or India, there's a couple of other countries that have been supplying them, that there's very little way to stop it unless they can start to convince the Mexican government to begin and restart their cooperation with us and start hitting these fentanyl labs. And you probably have all seen what is the Breaking Bad, where you needed the giant lab to make meth and all these chemical suits and respirators and everything. Well, fentanyl, you don't need any of that. You can make fentanyl in a room half this size. You don't need ventilation. You don't need respirators. It's a very simple process. And so that's another terrifying prospect is that it's so easy to make. It's so easy to conceal the operation, the manufacturing, but also the smuggling and the distribution of the drug. So it's a really daunting problem. So I know this is all so uplifting to all you guys. But it's a terrifying thing. A lot of experts in this field, and Beth has talked to many of them, will tell you that you have to reduce the demand side of this. And that's really the key way. You're not going to arrest your way out of this. You're not going to be able to use law enforcement to shut all this down. There's just no way you're going to do it. You have to stop people from wanting this drug. And that's a big challenge.
Shutting down an entire epidemic. What would it take to make Big Pharma acknowledge its role in the epidemic? It really hasn't. So what do you think it'll take, and what steps do you think, if they were ever to do that, could they make to curtail the epidemic, if they ever acknowledged?
I had an interview ask me that.
In a dream world.
If you could give Richard Sackler truth
Right.
serum,
Yeah.
what would you ask him? And I was just like, I think he buys his own bullshit. I think he thinks he's helping, has surrounded himself with paid sycophants who think he smells just great.
Yeah, I think until people are charged criminally,
Yep.
that's going to be the wake-up call. Because as Joe Renazizi says, guys in three-piece suits don't do well in prison. And all it's going to take is a couple of them with felony charges with jail time, not these charges that these Purdue guys have gotten, which are just basically bullshit, but like serious drug trafficking, conspiracy, RICO charges that are going to put people away for 10, 20 years. That's going to get the notice of a lot of people, and they will not behave this way because nobody wants to go to prison.
What do you think the public can do to put pressure on this? I mean, it's just so wrong. And then, I sat in and did some reporting on that congressional hearing about the Sackler Act, which was supposed to help with bankruptcy reform. And it all got hijacked about, it's the border. It's, all the Republicans were saying it's the fentanyl on the border and all the Mexicans bringing in the drugs. And it's just two sides talking over each other here in Washington.
Yeah.
I mean, Ed,
That makes
Ed
me
was involved in a
hopeless.
very big fentanyl rally, I think, last weekend. Those kind of things are important because I think people don't, it's like a blur, the opioid crisis. They think it's history. They don't realize it's worse now than it's ever been. It's going to be worse tomorrow. What is it, 235 people dying a day?
Yeah,
Like
maybe
a jet a 737 jet going down every day and killing everybody on board. And it's like people don't realize this is happening still.
Right.
And I think it's really great that the parents are trying to make people aware.
Yeah, I mean, I think
It's
the
like-
families rising up, like in a really major way, in a united way, in a persistent way. I mean, think back to the AIDS crisis, right? I mean, that community was so stigmatized. There was very little coordination among the victims and all these different communities, and they all came together. And if some of you were around back then, it was called ACT UP. And ACT UP became a cultural movement that really made a major difference and changed the way the culture looked at people who had AIDS. And we need a cultural change like that with people who are addicted to drugs, because it is a disease, and people need to realize that and stop stigmatizing people so that they can get the help that they need. And then also put a lot of pressure. I mean, if I was a parent, I would be out in front of the Justice Department every single day. Every single day, and I would get every other parent, thousands of parents, every day in front of the Justice Department demanding investigation, charges, a coordinated response to this. And the same thing on Capitol Hill. I mean, those people are so beholden to these companies. They're not beholden to us. You know, they're not beholden to the parents. You know,
It's so important that these stories get out, though, because until they do, people still think it's their dumb cousin that won't stop using, you know? And we have to put the onus on who the real criminals are.
Exactly.
I think the beauty of things like the Hulu, a show on Hulu that everyone has access to, and how Dopesick is done, really, shows all of these points that I think you want to make to the American society. So I think, shows like, if it gets on Hulu and Netflix and
Yeah.
all these people aren't necessarily exposed to the opioid epidemic in any way, are really going to see what the situation is. It makes you mad. The show makes you
Yeah.
mad.
Yeah,
Reading
it's a great
American
point.
Cartel makes you mad.
It's a
Sure
great
does.
point.
But that's very easy access. So those types of things, I'm sure lots of people are appreciative, and I know my mother-in-law particularly is so thankful for all the reporting that you do, but also the fact that it's getting this attention from even Hollywood now, and hopefully we can see some change from that. So
Yeah,
thank you.
that's the hope.
Any closing remarks? Anything, maybe on a close on a hopeful note? What gives you a little bit of hope going forward?
I mean, I was seeing all the parents last week in DC, and it was kind of like the AIDS quilt. It reminded me of all the faces on the fences around the White House. That gives me hope that there are a lot of people out there who are organizing. They're coming together. They're trying to fight this thing. I think like Dopesick is starting to change the conversation. Patrick Radden-Keefe's book is changing the conversation. I think people have to keep the pressure going. Yes, Ed.
Thanks, Scott. And just one thing I want to say, so Beth talked about this rally on Saturday. So one of the things, there's literally thousands of little groups across the country. And getting everybody to agree is like almost impossible. So I say, we can agree to disagree, but we all agree we want to save lives. So Saturday, there's over 80 groups coming together to do the Trail of Truth, it's called. We have over 1,000 tombstones with pictures of our loved ones. And we're going to meet at Union Square at 11, and at 3:30, they're going to march to HHS. And there's going to be speakers all day, and we're trying. There's thousands of parents out there, and there's, like they said, it's almost 300 a day now, more deaths per day. And the number's growing. In 2001, I went to the very first congressional hearing on OxyContin. 2001. I tried my best, and I always said, until enough people are affected, we're not going to get change. And eventually, it took 15 years. Eventually, they did crack down on Oxy, it took way too long, and now we have this fentanyl. And unless the government does a COVID-type response, it's just going to grow and grow. But guess what? Eventually, every single family will be affected, and that's when real change will happen. But
Oh, why do we
unfortunately, a
have to
lot
wait
more are
that long?
going to die before then.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great note to end on.
Beth, you had something to say.
I was just going to say that the best thing I've heard about the show is a mother reached out to our team to say that for the first time in 3 years, she called her addicted son. And that's, you know, that echoes the McDonald's parking lot scene. We've got to reach out to these people. We've got to stop treating them like lepers. You know, a lot of families are just torn asunder by this. And we really need more government intervention. We need leadership at every single level. I was really frustrated at the beginning as I was reporting the new book. I thought, like, do we have to reinvent the wheel in every community? Well, the answer is healthcare is largely decided locally, as is, I mean, talk to a county sheriff. They're the highest elected law enforcement official in the nation. And we do have to get involved locally, but we need our state and federal leaders to really step up. And, you know, they can do a lot of things with their purse strings to get these policies changed. And we need an ACT UP and a Ryan White Act that would, similar to making treatment on demand like we did as a result of ACT UP for the HIV crisis. We can do this.
Sari, I forget, did you have a chance to say what you wanted to in terms of
Well,
what you're hopeful about?
the one thing I would just add to this is we're talking a lot about people who are addicted. The other thing we have to remember for anyone who's a parent of a child in high school, college, in your 20s, who may not be addicted, but who might go to a party and be given a Xanax or given an Adderall or given an oxycodone pill at a party, that pill could kill them. And that message really needs to get out to our kids. I was just talking to my daughter, who's actually in her 30s, about this today, that do not take anything that's not from a doctor, that's at, you know, from a party, from a friend, whatever, because we don't know what's in it. It's in cocaine, it's in meth, it's in all these different pills, Xanax, Adderall, are there any other pills I haven't, but it's in everything. And you know, we have to get the word out to parents to talk to their children.
Thank you. Before we conclude today's discussion, let me take a moment to thank headliners, co-team leaders Donna Lanwan-Legere and Lori Russo, as well as Club Communications Director Kate Helster and Club Executive Director Bill McCarran. We also invite you to join us a week from today on Thursday, September 29th at 6:30 p.m. to hear from Dr. Joan Donovan, Research Director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Policy at Harvard University, and journalist Emily Dreyfus to discuss their new book, Memoirs, The Untold Story of the Online Battles Upending Democracy in America, that explores the spread of disinformation online. And now I would like to present to each one of you the National Press Club mug. I'll just pass them on down here. Thank you so much. You've earned it.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you for your coverage.
Thank you. We love swag.
Journalists do.
Yeah, we really appreciate